All right. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. We've got a lot of folks, many of whom I've met. Many of you are new. So today we're going to be doing a new thing for Seaborn, which is a webinar. So we get to do a lot of interesting work with a lot of different organizations, but often don't get to share it with folks. So today we're going to try a different approach of putting this out on the web, and hopefully it's helpful and interesting to you all. So as we dive in here, a couple of housekeeping items. This is a little different from what we usually do in that I can't actually hear you. So we have a couple of tools, the chat on the sidebar, and then the questions. So I'm going to run through the slides and shoot for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes of content here. As we're going, feel free to put questions into the sidebar there. And at the end, we'll kind of go through those. There's some voting options that you can try as well. So I guess the ones that come to the top we'll do first and work our way down. The other thing to note, this is the start of what we hope is a series. So there's only so much we can cover in the time that we have today, and this is obviously a really rich, deep topic. So would love to know if there's other areas of what we talked about today that would be useful to explore further, or other topics around data and visualization. We have some in mind, but would really value any feedback you all have on what we could do that would be useful and interesting. So with that, we'll dive in a little bit. For those of you that don't know who I am or who we are, my name is Mike Reich, and I'm CEO of Seaborn. We're a data strategy and engineering firm. We've been around about 10 years, and primarily we work in health, climate change, equity, and civic engagement. So we do a lot of work around both kind of the tactical nitty-gritty of data and how you analyze, define, characterize these different areas, but also focus a lot on strategy. Sort of how do you think about data? How do you involve it in your decision-making process? How do you communicate to stakeholders with data? So we do a lot of work with NGOs, health systems, companies, government agencies. You can find more about us at our website, seabornconsulting.com. So what we're hoping to cover today is equity. And as I said, there's a lot there. So specifically, we'd like to talk about generally, how do you think about equity? How can you define it? You have to be able to define it, to quantify it. What data can be helpful? There's a ton of data out there. So we'll talk more about kind of the characteristics of data. How can I analyze it to highlight equity issues? There's some specific analysis approaches that work really well for looking at equity issues. We'll also go over some visualization approaches and talk about kind of next steps and bigger thoughts around this topic. So what is equity? In our work, it's an interesting topic because we found people tend to mean two different things when they talk about equity, or there's two concepts kind of embedded in that term. The first is disparity, and this is the idea that all things being equal, there's a difference between two different groups, and so you want to measure the space between them, or the distance. And you can think about, we use kind of poverty as an example throughout. The disparity in poverty rates would be the distance between, say, the white population and the non-Hispanic Black population. And so measuring that and that idea of disparity is often what people are actually thinking of when they talk about equity. And the other side of the coin, or in thinking about disparity, I mean, one of the key things there is low disparity isn't necessarily always good. And that's one of kind of the gotchas around thinking about equity issues is there's some nuance there. And if you have two populations that are significantly below the poverty level, they may not have much disparity between them, but when you look at them in the broader context, it's not necessarily a good outcome that they're both significantly below the poverty level. So this can be helpful when you're looking at a large spread, but it's one of the things you need to be careful of in looking at different populations. So the other side of the coin is thinking about equality, and this is all things being equal, what proportion of different populations achieve the same outcomes. And This one can be a little bit tricky to communicate to folks. Many people, because this is kind of a little bit of an abstract concept in that you're looking at where do the different populations overlap and what percentage of those populations achieve the same outcome. So generally, this is calculated as a ratio or a percentage of 0 to 1. And 1 being completely equal, that is 100% of both populations achieve the same outcome, 0 being 0% of both populations have any overlap. And so this can be really useful, but again, it's a little challenging to communicate to folks sometimes. So I think why we see a focus on disparity is often because it's a little easier to understand. So, one of the things, equity is also a little bit of a loaded term, and it really is just a way to describe a relationship. So we always come back to this idea. The important question is not equity or what is equity or what is the state of equity. It's the equity of what? Is it economy, population, poverty? There's a whole bunch of different topic areas that you could apply the analysis of disparity and equality to. Specifically, the ones that we see a lot are employment, education, health, environment, well-being, access to care, access to transportation. There's a whole bunch of different ways to characterize that. But typically, you want to think about equity within one of these domains because that's going to give you more specific, actionable information. So as you think about what data do you need to examine equity, there's a ton of data. So the way that we kind of filter through is, some guiding principles and then some specific things to look for. So first, because equity is a relationship of different populations to one another, the way to think about it is you want data that has more facets, what we call facets, which are ways to basically segment a population, right? So you can think of it as like age or race and ethnicity. You want data sources that provide a lot of different segments, a lot of different ways to look at a population, because that gives you more ways to slice and dice it and look at disparity and equality. The other thing to know is good data needs to be consistent. Another way to put that is you want to compare apples to apples. So usually looking at equity issues within one data set is a good idea. You can look at equity across data sets, and we'll talk about some techniques to do that, but you want to be more careful about comparing similar and like populations. And then ultimately, and this is a point we'll hit on a lot, the data you select is really, should be driven by the type of questions you want to ask and the specific domains that you're interested in. So some common facets that you will want to look for in data: age, obviously, race, ethnicity, location, geographic equity and geographic disparity is one of the most common and easy to understand ways of looking at equity issues. Education, time period, these are all different sort of facets, different ways of slicing and dicing the data. And the sources that we tend to use are the ones that you're probably already familiar with to some degree. Census, American Community Survey, BLS has a lot of good economic data, employment data. County Health Rankings obviously has a good amount of information about population and community health. CDC, Wonder was the source for a lot of the mortality statistics and health outcome statistics. Burfus and 500 cities obviously have some interesting data about health outcomes. So the real question, and rather than focusing on any particular data source, is how do you analyze these different data sources in interesting ways to understand equity? And this is really kind of the meat of the challenge is how do you pull out the talking points, the data points that are going to inform decision and action? So we think of this as, in considering analysis in a three-step process, the first step is identifying the outcomes that you want to achieve or the actions that you want to take. So if you're a part of a community collaborative, obviously, one of the most important questions is, what is our focus? What is our theory of action? What do we think the challenges faced by our community are? What are the equity issues that we already know exist? And what do we want to be able to do about them? And that should inform the selection of data and the analysis approach that you take. So once you've identified that, you want to go look for what are the sources of data that are likely to be most relevant. If we're focused on poverty, you're going to want to obviously look at the percentage of the population above or below the poverty rate, but you're also going to want to look at other factors like employment, education opportunities, access to childcare, transportation. There's a whole range of different options, and depending on the particular interest areas and assets within your community, the data that you look at is going to be different, because you want to focus on the things that are most relevant and the places where you see the most need of an improvement. So the third step, once you have an idea of the types of data you want to look at, is what's the analysis that answers the questions that you have. So we'll walk through a couple of different, I think there's 3 or 4 different analysis approaches here, and some visualizations that you can use along the way to help explain this. So especially if you're comparing 2 populations, the easiest way to look at that is the direct comparison. And another way to think of this is, what's the difference in annual wages between the white and non-Hispanic Black population, for example. So it's a simple subtraction, and you get the difference between the two. And for example, that might be $32,000. So this is very easy to do. You can do it with almost any subpopulation data within an indicator, a data set. But it also kind of lacks context. Is 32,000 a lot or a little? If the overall, populations are making 150,000 and 128,000 or 118,000, that's not particularly germane. So this can be useful as a starting point, but we would often recommend taking a more sophisticated approach, one that gives you more context about kind of the overall state. So good ways to visualize these direct comparisons. A couple of examples here. I mean, obviously you can give a number. That's probably the simplest way, but in thinking about data visualizations, the 2 that come up a lot that we really like in doing these direct comparisons are the geographic heat map. And this allows you to see the disparity between the populations as a function of color. So you can kind of color code where red is worse and green is better. This way you see not just sort of the overall disparity between the populations, but where are they located? And this can be really helpful in driving action and informing priority, and informing if you're looking at programs and interventions around equity issues, where do you go? Where are the biggest disparities, not just which population has the biggest disparities. And then we also like this stacked area chart, because this gives you a sense both of the overall whole, so what is the overall poverty rate within a community, but you can segment that within the different populations and start to see the differences between those populations. The next thing that you can look at is outcome comparison. And so again, this is getting more towards equality. And so what you're interested in is how equal are the obesity rates between Asians and African Americans, for example. So what you're interested in is, again, a number that gets closer to 1, because that means it's perfectly equal between the 2. And again, equality is the comparison of 2 populations against a desired outcome. So the way that we like to represent these are usually things that you would represent as percentages otherwise. Bringing it into context of the overall population, this person diagram can be really helpful. If you have 100 people, you have some proportion of them who are sort of meeting the outcome. And then obviously pie charts, and you can do stacked bar charts. There's a lot of other ways to look at it. Third way to think about it is benchmark comparison, or third way to analyze data. And this is the one that comes up quite a bit. It's probably where most organizations focus, because it gives you not just the value or the disparity between populations, but it allows you to understand what's the context of that disparity. So you're usually looking at a benchmark that's the national average of everybody in the country, or within a state or within a particular region. And you can ask questions like, how does the poverty rate for the Asian population within an area compare to the national average? And so that'll give you sort of the above or below by some percentage. And once you start doing this, you get into some pretty interesting visualization approaches. The first is on the left there is a breakdown of all the populations, where the center line is the mean, in this case, a state average. If you're above, you're doing better, and if you're below, you're doing worse. This starts to give you a lot of information in a view, not just what's the average, but how are these different populations doing relative to the average and doing relative to themselves. So it gives you a little bit of that straight disparity comparison, as well as the overall context of the average. And then you can do this with geographic areas as well. So thinking about, here we've got two separate regions compared against each other, and then compared against the average or the mean. So you can get really sophisticated with how you do benchmarking and how your benchmark is determined. So rather than doing just an average across a particular region, you can do population benchmarks. You can do things like an urban cities index benchmark, where you're just looking at the top 50 or 100 urban centers by population, or conversely, you can do a rural benchmark. So there's a lot of different interesting ways to do these types of comparisons. The next way to think about this is significance. So how significant is poverty in our community? And this begins to be a more significant, or a more interesting way of looking at the overall spread or distribution of populations in an area. And so one of the things you're interested in, if you look at just a percentage change off of a mean, that's neat. But again, you don't know, is that significantly better, significantly worse? What's the significance of that relative to some sort of benchmark that we set? And so the way that you can think about doing that is using some more complicated statistics of finding the standard deviation and mean of a sample set, and then you can generate z-scores, and from that develop a percentile of where the value sits along that distribution. And this can be both extremely valuable, but we're starting to get into pretty wonky sort of data analysis techniques. So we find significance is really helpful when you're looking at a large, say, national distribution of, if you're looking at a number of different communities, or you want to compare communities, the significance analysis can be really helpful in doing that. And one of the ones we use a lot is what we call the fuel gauge diagram on the left there. And that gives you the pretty simple, straightforward z-score, or standard deviation from the mean, that the value falls into. The other one that's more complex there is the box and whisker diagram, where the box is sort of the one standard deviation value, or 66% fall within that box, and then the outside bounds, and then you can map your values on that. So it can be helpful, but again, this takes a little bit more effort around interpretation and communication. So last, I wanted to talk a little bit about composite scores and indexes, which are both different ways of rolling up multiple indicators to provide a customized view of equity. And this point of equity is relative and unique, and really sort of context dependent and community dependent. Composite scores and indexes are a really good way of reflecting that complexity by rolling up indicators in a way that's more easy to understand. So composites in particular, it's the simpler approach, and it's usually just rolling these up and doing a simple sum, so you get a big number, but you're bringing together some multiple number of indicators. And if you use an approach like calculating z-scores, you get an apples-to-apples comparison that you can add up and really get a sense of the overall sort of direction that composite is taking. And so you may build a composite, for example, around unemployment that would include not just the unemployment rate, but access to educational opportunities, access to jobs, different breakdowns of industry sectors, et cetera. Indexes are more complex because they're like composites with an additional weighting factor, or even an algorithm that gets more complex for determining the significance of each indicator going into the index. So for example, County Health Rankings has a framework that they apply different weightings to each of the 40 some odd indicators to come up with category values. This can be a really useful way of looking at equity issues as well, by bringing this index approach, because you can say in our community, poverty is the most significant issue, and we want to more highly weight that than things like access to transportation, for example. Because there's a lot of data that goes into these, there's also more complex visualization approaches, and you're trying to put a lot on the screen. So these are also kind of multi-dimensional calculations, so they're a little hard to unpack. The one on the left is one that we've used a lot around population health, which is a way of showing a composite score, in this case for cardiovascular disease and stroke, where each one of these indicators contributes to the score, but the score is ultimately just a straight average of the z-scores within the components of the composite. The one on the right is a heat map, but not a geographic heat map. It's a tabular heat map, but it gives you a good sense. You have about 4 dimensions of data that you can put into here. So it can give you a good sense of the weightings and seeing trends, especially if you apply it to changes over time, seeing trends within populations and then changes between populations over time. So, so final thoughts, and then we'll do some questions, and yeah, so here we go. So wrapping all this up, again, there is no one-size-fits-all answer to, is my community equitable? The question is my community equitable with respect to a particular issue that's important to me? And that can be different for everybody. And it is different for everybody. So we really encourage folks to think about equity in this broader context as more of a way of looking at a problem rather than in of itself something that you want to focus on. To that end, it's the start, not the end, of understanding equity issues. So doing this, any one of these analysis approaches gives you some good questions, hopefully, some starting places to look at why there are these disparities or why certain populations have significant equality around a health outcome, and begin to dig deeper. Because ultimately you want to understand the why so that you can do more of it or less of it, depending on which direction you want to go. Which gets us to the third thought. This is an area where we notice there's a real desire to focus on correlations as causal relationships. And so don't forget the old truism, correlation is not causation, because these are complex issues without clear answers. And so we want to be very careful of not drawing conclusions that the data can't support. So correlations are just that. They're correlations, and they may be something interesting to look at. They may not. They may just be random chance. And then the last thought, composites and indexes, though they are the most complex, they're also where we see folks finding the most value, and especially in thinking about equity issues within a large geographic area or a diverse community. Indexes and composites are really the only way to capture the complexity of reality. And so there's a lot of interest in taking this approach and thinking about what are the different weightings, what are the different ways that a composite or index can help us consolidate hundreds of data points into something that's much more easy to understand and easy to act on. So I would encourage everybody to think about the combination of multiple indicators together in their analysis of equity. All right, so that's that. Let's focus and look and see if we've got any questions. So a couple of thoughts. I will send around the slides. Somebody asked that. So you'll get an email after we wrap up here that has a screencast, a video of this that you can watch or you can share, but we'll also send the slides around, and feel free to pass around and use as you'd like. All right, so any questions, any areas that folks would like to dive deeper? All right, so Stephanie asks, is the data you use open or proprietary? Generally, we focus on open data. I think within this space of equity, there is the best data that you can get is from government sources. There certainly are others. There's big data firms like Nielsen and others that can give you specific data sets. There's a lot of private sector data, especially around the economy. And then there are some firms that do sell data sets, especially where they're using instruments to do data collection. So they're actually taking surveys. A lot of that is proprietary, but for 95% of what we do, the public data that's available is more than adequate to answering these questions. So, so hopefully that answers your question, Stephanie. Yeah. All right, and yeah, we again, we will be putting. You'll get an email with this, and we'll follow up with the slides at the end. So, Marty asks, do you think public data is of equal quality geographically? That's a great question. It really depends on the data source. I think that one of the biggest challenges that folks face in doing any type of data analysis, whether it's equity related or not, is geographic granularity. So there's a lot of data. One of the interesting things around opioid addiction, for example, or opioid deaths, only exists really at the state level, and then there's some county level data, but it's not very fine grained, and so that definitely presents some challenges, to analysis. But I would say, you look at the census data, ACS, it's sort of the gold standard for geographic data broken out by pretty fine-grained geography. So it really just depends on the data source and ultimately how much money has gone into the data collection. All right, Ari asks, what are some of the most recent or cutting-edge measures of equity being used on a national scale? Yeah, so that's a great question. And again, I think this is probably issue specific. So there are, I would agree, I think the most sophisticated approaches are going to be those that are putting composite measures or indexes together. And so, in our work, the thing I'd highlight, and there's a few folks on the phone who are pretty involved in this, is the broader well-being frameworks, I think, provide really interesting ways to think about the overall sort of context and contributions of indicators to well-being in a community. And that stuff, I think, is really interesting to apply an equity analysis to, because, obviously well-being within a community is going to have disparities and equalities just like anything else. And so those well-being frameworks are nice because they touch on something that's interesting to everybody, usually broken out into pretty broad categories with hundreds of indicators. So there's something there for everyone, and I think a pretty good evidence base behind it. All right, well, we are just at the end of our half hour. So one last question came in. Okay, we'll touch on that. Are there agreed upon measures of equity? That's a great question. I think there are issues that have a critical mass of folks saying that they need to be addressed. Poverty is obviously one. Access to healthcare and health outcomes, I think, are others. So I think absolutely there are sort of topics of equity which have a lot of interest around them, and I think everybody within those topics chooses indicators that are more useful for what it is they're looking at. So this is kind of a non-answer, and I'll fully cop to that and acknowledge it. I would say that it's all relative, but where you do have critical mass, I think, is in using the best data, which is going to come from ACS for population level characteristics. The CDC and the BRFIS data, I think, has probably the gold standard is 500 cities data for health behaviors and to some degree outcomes. So I would say those are probably de facto where there's critical mass, just because the data quality is so high and there's so much more granularity that you can use to do a really good equity analysis. All right. Well, just wrapping up, I want to thank everybody for taking the time. Hopefully this was helpful. Again, would love to know if this raises questions, if there's any other topics that we can cover. We will be doing at least one of these next month, so we'll send around to everybody. And hopefully you can find it useful. So you'll get a link to the video. We'll also send out the slides afterwards. And feel free to let us know if you have any questions. So hope everybody has a good rest of the day, and we'll talk soon.